resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide, while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little opposition, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely, at a cost of only 20 dead. When he came ashore to see the situation for himself, he was surrounded by the world's media, anxious to record the man who'd set a new pinnacle on an already brilliant military career. With an eye to posterity, he posed readily with his men, savouring his moment of triumph. But for them, it wasn't over yet. 10 Corps' commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back. They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard. Official notice of Seoul's capture went out on the 25th as planned. Though there were 2 more days of hard fighting before the North Koreans were driven from the city, and by then much of it had been reduced to rubble. Mass graves revealed that their brief tenure of South Korea had been a savage affair for those they saw as opponents. Yet as power passed back to the South Koreans, many UN soldiers were equally shocked by the roundup of suspected collaborators who were forced to wear the traditional mask of the criminal before being marched off to an unknown fate. But the official tone was one of celebration.
General MacArthur makes a personal visit to Seoul, where he returns the government of the Republic to President Syngman Rhee. With tears in his eyes, the Supreme Commander completes his first assignment under the United Nations banner.
The day after the Incheon landings, the 8th Army began pushing northwards to link up with 10 Corps. It took 3 days of hard fighting to cross the Naktong River. Then the pace quickened as the North Korean line broke. Isolated groups retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla war. But short of supplies, they could do little against the weight of the 8th Army. The UN had learnt from its early experience and now possessed 500 medium tanks to lead the advance along the narrow roads. And close air support quickened the pace. During the debacle of July, the lack of coordination had squandered UN air superiority. Now they made it tell. Napalm became a preferred weapon in Korea. Though militarily effective, its widespread use had horrific consequences for civilians. The carrier-launched prop planes were now joined by Navy jets. The F-9 Panther was the first of the new breed to see combat. From their floating airfields, they could always keep the fluid front line within range, carrying their enhanced firepower anywhere over the Korean mainland. By the end of September, the surviving North Koreans had fled back across the parallel, or been rounded up as the UN forces cut their retreat. With South Korea nominally under his control, Syngman Rhee seized the initiative. On the 1st of October, he ordered his own troops across the 38th parallel, in pursuit not only of the northern forces, but of his own dream of a reunited Korea. A week later, the UN forces followed them. Hours after they crossed, a UN resolution ordered that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. MacArthur again split his forces in two. While the 8th Army drove on due north of Seoul towards Pyongyang, he sent 10 Corps round to effect a landing at Wonsan on the east coast, hoping to repeat the success of Incheon. This time it failed. The front line had already moved north, and 10 Corps followed, driving towards the Chosin Reservoir and the Yalu River, the border with China. On the west coast, the 8th Army took Pyongyang on the 19th of October, the only time the West ever held the communist capital. Syngman Rhee addressed the crowds from the balcony where his opponent had once stood. All Korea now seemed in his grasp. Among the UN forces, thoughts were turning to home. Their work in Korea seemed finished. Some troops were already preparing to leave. But a week after the fall of Pyongyang, everything was to change. The Chinese entered the war. They poured out of the hills, hitting the UN columns in massive human waves. On the battlefield, surprise was total. Yet the UN intelligence services had consistently discounted the obvious danger of Chinese intervention. Mao Zedong's hold on China after the Civil War was barely secure in 1950. American military and political support for his opponent, Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalist forces on Formosa was a constant threat. The presence of American forces along the Korean-Chinese border could make his position untenable. As soon as the Americans crossed the 38th parallel, Mao ordered his armies to act. Chinese films portray the preparation of a volunteer army going to the aid of North Korea. In reality, 200,000 men of the battle-hardened Red Army made their way across the Yalu River into the mountains of North Korea. Travelling light, without radio communications, they hit the UN forces without warning. Yet after 2 days, they disengaged, just as suddenly melting back into the mountains. They left captured prisoners as the only proof of their involvement, and the UN assumed the threat was gone. Nevertheless, MacArthur ordered the Air Force to create a wasteland of the entire area between the front line and the Yalu River, not only to destroy supply lines or enemy concentrations, but as a deliberate punitive demonstration of the sheer power the Allies possessed in the air. They attacked every factory, every city and every village with incendiary bombs and napalm. But suddenly they were attacked themselves. The arrival of the first MiG-15 jets in November astounded Western pilots. That the communists had developed a jet, and one that actually outmaneuvered their own F-80 Shooting Stars in the first jet-powered dogfights, was a profound shock. It was not until the arrival of the F-86 Sabre that they were able to redress the balance in MiG Alley, despite being forbidden to pursue the MiGs to their Chinese bases. The Sabre was to be the principal fighter for the rest of the war, operated by a new generation of highly skilled pilots. The new jet aces became folk heroes in the United States, as they vied for the record number of kills. On the ground, MacArthur attacked again on the 24th of November, still confident of taking all Korea by Christmas. For 2 days, his forces pushed northwards towards the Yalu River. Then the Chinese came out of the hills again, and this time they weren't going back. The UN had pushed deeper into communist-held territory, and when the Chinese attacked, it was from the flanks and behind, as well as at the head of the columns. The 8th Army in the west was once again taken totally by surprise, and whole sections of the line simply panicked and collapsed. They lost 11,000 men in the first few days. many were marched off to face the dreadful privations of North Korean and Chinese prison camps. It became known as the Big Bug Out, the worst American military defeat for a century. A whole army disengaged, joining the thousands of refugees jamming the road south. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. They abandoned Pyongyang in the headlong rush south, leaving it burning in their wake. But for 10 Corps in the eastern mountains, there was nowhere to run. One of the hardest battles of the war was fought by the 20,000 Marines surrounded beside the Chosin Reservoir, where the temperatures fell to -30 below. The advance guard pushing onto the Yalu River had been decimated. The few survivors who had fought their way back to the base of the reservoir were evacuated from the airstrip, wounded or frostbitten or both. The rest were faced with the long fight back to the coast through 6 Chinese divisions, in conditions which made mere survival a struggle. They still took their heavy equipment, and as always, their dead with them. Airdrops were their lifeline. Whole bridge sections had to be dropped at one point to cross a gorge south of Koto Ri, which threatened to end the epic march there. "We're not retreating," said the Marines commander. "We're advancing in a different direction." That advance continued along 20 miles of mountain road. The Chinese continually worked their way in to harry the column. For them too, the road from Chosin caused incredible suffering. Under constant threat from the air, they couldn't even light fires for fear of bringing down a hail of bombs on their position. And frostbite accounted for many of their losses. On the 10th of December, 10 Corps finally marched into the port of Hungnam and prepared for evacuation south. Some thought they could have held a perimeter around their biggest base in the north, but the will to take risks had gone. The volume of supplies was too great to move, and Hungnam turned into a vision of hell as Koreans fought in the streets for precious foodstuffs. An orgy of destruction followed as engineers destroyed anything of use to the Chinese. And the departing fleet vented its frustration by shelling the city in a final embittered flourish before turning south to Busan, leaving the civilian population to fend for themselves. The scale of the defeat sent shockwaves through America, and extreme measures were being considered at the White House. President Truman made it clear that he considered the situation grave enough to warrant a nuclear solution.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
Britain's Prime Minister Attlee flew to America on behalf of the Allies, seeking assurances against the use of nuclear bombs, and the talk of weapons of mass destruction was toned down. Truman chose another path. On December the 17th, he signed an emergency proclamation putting the economy on a war footing. The massive rearmament drive he launched would continue long after Korea and have a... They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard. Official notice of Seoul's capture went out on the 25th as planned. Position, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely at a cost of only 20 dead. When he came ashore to see the situation for himself, he was surrounded by the world's media, anxious to record the man who'd set a new pinnacle on an already brilliant military career. Resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide. while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little though there were 2 more days of hard fighting before the North Koreans were driven from the city, and by then much of it had been reduced to rubble. With an eye to posterity, he posed readily with his men, savouring his moment of triumph. But for them, it wasn't over yet. 10 Corps commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back.